And thanks to everybody online who's joining us. I wanted to start with a couple of things as well. And, before we begin, I want to acknowledge that since this meeting is being held online, a singular land acknowledgement doesn't capture the richness of our distribution across the many locations in Canada. So I invite all of the guests who are joining us to consider their own position in regard to the land in which they find themselves on. And speaking of those lands, I'm very curious about who is joining us and where you're from. And so in the chat function, you're welcome to introduce yourself and what community or what land acknowledgement you'd like to provide us with, or the territory that you're representing. I met with our panelists yesterday, and to say that a little debrief about process was rich, would be an understatement. I'm really looking forward to this. So I'm here much like yourselves. I'm here as a learner in this space, and one who has curiosity about social innovation, how it's linked to prevention. And so I, like you, will be here taking notes and scribbling down ideas. So please do that. We have a space that we're in that is, again, virtual, but I want you to think about and maybe envision this as a bit of a fireside conversation. Our panelists have been open to the idea that we're going to stray from what a typical maybe webinar should look like, and that we're not going to do presentations. We're going to have this be a mostly moderated, facilitated discussion with some opportunity for the panelists to provide some background on their work at the beginning. And so picture maybe, us all in a circle, our panelists in the middle, and all of you around us in helping shape this conversation and add some essence to the togetherness that we have in this space, our own curiosity about this space, and have that sort of influence your thinking maybe about the questions that you might answer or ask. So I'll introduce our panelists briefly. And so firstly, Chelsey MacNeil is an entrepreneur, business developer, and social innovator based in St. John's, Newfoundland. She is the director of social enterprise at Choices for Youth, a nationally recognized nonprofit dedicated to serving at-risk and homeless youth, and has over 10 years of experience developing business models and refining best practices to bring the best of individuals to their communities through small business. Next, we have Emmy Kelly, who is the COO at Blue Door, an organization working in York Region to ensure that everyone has safe, affordable, and supportive housing. Recently, having achieved her master's in business administration, she's received a dissertation and Student of the Year awards for her business planning of Blue Door's social enterprise, Construct. She is proud of Construct's launch and the success of their team, and will provide careers and possibility of housing up to 128 individuals by the end of 2021. We'll learn more about that in a minute. And Marc Soberano started Building Up 7 years ago, and the organization has since trained over 400 people with barriers to employment, of which 85% are employed full-time in the construction trades. Building Up has more recently taken on the leadership of Raising the Roof, and are working there to use social enterprise as a tool to prevent and end homelessness across Canada. Those are our panelists. And so before we get into that facilitated dialogue, I've asked our panelists to go into a bit more of detail about their specific work in their communities and within their organizations. So we're going to hear from Chelsey first.
Hi, everyone, and so great to virtually meet all of you. I have the privilege, certainly the privilege, of representing Choices for Youth, which is a youth servicing agency here in St. John's, Newfoundland, a tropical island of. We've been in the business of assisting young people with a variety, all the things that we all need to ensure that we lead happy and healthy lives. And so Choices for Youth started almost 30 years ago, connecting young people with housing. I was born out of very unfortunate circumstances, the closure of Mount Cashel, which was an orphanage here in St. John's, and it was created to really assist the young people with their transition from the Mount Cashel to community. And what became very evident is that not only did young people in that situation require assistance with their housing, but we had issues, systemic issues certainly, that were facing young people all throughout the urban center of St. John's. From there, Choices for Youth really blossomed and developed really in an agile way to assist young people with all the things that perhaps create the symptom, which is homelessness, but the issues are perhaps more far-reaching. Things certainly facing young people here in our region are poverty, intergenerational trauma, family breakdown, access to education and supports, addictions and mental health. So as Choice for Youth grew over the last 30 years, was really looking to solve for a lot of those issues that create the conditions for homelessness for our young people. So fast forward certainly to today, and Choices for Youth operates housing, supportive housing, affordable housing all throughout the St. John's metro area, whether it's congregate housing with our Lily building, which provides congregate living, supportive congregate living, to independent community-based supports for young people living on their own, to our 9-bed young men's shelter. We really have a focus certainly on supporting young people with their housing, but recognizing that the continuum, we need to service in the continuum. So we do operate an outreach center that supports young people with health and access to in-community supports. We run family programs that assist pregnant and parenting young moms. We have programming certainly in the employment and supports, which is what we're here to talk about today. And so our employment and supports program really has been created on the foundationally around social enterprise. So 10 years ago, we were building the Lily building, which I had mentioned, which is this beautiful building downtown St. John's. We knew we were building congregate housing for young people, but one of the things that, during the planning process, as all nonprofits are kind of scrappy, we want to be able to extract as much value as we can when doing any work in the community. So we asked ourselves, how could this build support young people? And one of the things that we recognize that young people, in order to maintain housing, they need a connection with a job, an income. And so we thought, what if we, while building the Lily building and renovating this building, we were able to train young people in construction and trades. From there, that program, we were able to train and support over 20 young people. And the most significant intervention we were able to create was actually access to health services. So we really knew we were onto something when it came to supporting young people through not just their housing, but also with a job. And what can a job unlock in terms of the opportunities for a young person to be self-determining, but at the same time be able to wrap supports around them so that they can be more successful. So we've built our portfolio of social enterprises from there over the last 8 years to reflect young people's needs, both from a holistic perspective in terms of what everybody needs to go to work, which is access to safe, affordable housing, which is transportation, necessary supports on the job to be successful, access to education and career development. But then also, what can a job unlock as a transitional tool to teach a young person how to show up, be at work, make mistakes, and have exposure to a variety of different types of work so that they can make a choice to see their own potential in terms of being self-determining. So our portfolio has 4 businesses. We run Impact Construction, which is a construction and trades program, and business. We run The Shop, which is a manufacturing and production facility where young people get to exercise their creative muscles in the creation of products for the shop, but then also for small to medium-sized businesses here in the city. We also run Neighborhood, which is an inclusive, affordable, family-oriented secondhand store. We have one neighborhood right now, but we're planning for expansion this summer for a few more. And our last, I think the one that we're just incubating now is in food production. So as you can see, that portfolio of choice is really important. Young people need to, what a young person should have choice, just like housing first philosophy. And so with that choice, we get to wrap supports around, do some good career development work, and also allow for the young person to try on what employment looks like and create that career path forward for them. So that's it for me.
Amazing. Chelsey, well done. Congratulations, choices. Next, over to Emmy.
So I'm at Blue Door, which is an organization in York Region that focuses on supporting those experiencing or at risk of homelessness. And next year, actually, we're going to be celebrating our 40th anniversary. And Blue Door, historically, actually, it started as a very small shelter in the community. And over the years, Blue Door was known for its support through emergency housing to vulnerable populations in York Region. Just a few years ago, actually, the organization started innovating around that and recognizing the need to provide more of a housing continuum rather than only focusing on emergency housing. 2 years ago, Michael Braithwaite also joined us, who I'm pretty sure spends a lot of his days and nights thinking about and finding solutions to homelessness, and dedicates his life to that. And so he has also been instrumental in leading the organization into a new strategic plan, which focuses on the determinants of health, housing, of course, health, and employment. So in 2019, I think the idea was born to start a social enterprise. And really, we started looking at the fact that our programs had been, although we had employment-focused programs, they were really in some ways doing our clients a disservice because the employment possibilities that we were offering to our clients were many times moving them into minimum wage jobs just because of their capabilities or their spot in life at that time. So, while we were putting forth our best efforts, it just wasn't what was needed. What we discovered was to even rent a one-bedroom apartment in York Region, they needed to be making about $24 to $27 an hour. And going into a minimum wage job at around 14 to 15 left a huge shortfall there in allowing people to have housing stability. So really our best intentions were quite lacking. That's when we started thinking about how do we really solve this problem intelligently? How do we not only prevent homelessness, but for the people who are already experiencing homelessness, how do we actually help them break that cycle of poverty and move them from, this instability into actually being able to retain housing and moving on with a more successful life? And really, the solution seems quite simple when you say it, like, how do we all afford our homes, right? It's from being able to be plugged into a great career and opportunities that allow you to pay rent or pay your mortgage. And that's when we started having conversations with great minds like Marc and Chelsey and others in the field who had gone on before to start social enterprises. And so, I was just lucky at the time to be studying for my master's and took on this project to do the business planning for Construct. And in that way, it did. So like for anyone listening who's actually interested to start this for their organizations, there are so many great organizations out there already doing this work. And so by being able to pick their brains for the research, it kind of set up Construct to be in a very strong position from the get-go. And we have been able to, like with the focus of government right now, and all the opportunities, of course, there's been a lot of challenges, but the opportunities as well that have presented through COVID, we've been able to engage all levels of government, private foundations, corporate sector, And I see Emily here from the Home Depot Canada Foundation as well. You'll hear more from us in the coming months because they have been a huge solutionary in this opportunity as well, bringing together social enterprises from across Canada to launch a program called TradeWorks. So we'll be talking about that in the next couple months as well, but it's pretty exciting. And I'm gonna zip the lip and give it over to Marc.
Excellent. Yeah, over to you, Marc.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Marc, and I started Building Up about 7 years ago, which is a nonprofit contractor social enterprise. When you tell people in the construction industry that you're a nonprofit contractor, they all don't understand. I've seen a few heads explode. But it's pretty easy to kind of explain what this is and why it exists. And really, it started from this idea that there are towers of affordable housing that all need a ton, like there's a lot of housing that needs to be built. But there's also a lot of housing that exists and isn't in great shape. And all the contractors that are going to be hired to do all this work, you know, can do a great job, but then all the skills and the income that could have been generated from those projects would just leak out of the buildings that are filled with people that are looking for projects. Meanwhile, there's a construction industry that is looking for workers and is willing to pay them. So why not connect the dots, use work in the nonprofit sector to create contracts that we can then use to train and employ people with barriers to employment, and then to use that as a launch pad into these jobs where the industry is saying, hey, we need people, we're willing to pay them, but they need support to be ready to take on these roles. And that's kind of what Building Up and Construct and Impact, we're all trying to do, is kind of bridge that gap between the construction sector working, like looking for people, and the community filled with people looking for work, people that are experiencing homelessness, at risk of homelessness. And it's been really cool to see that kind of space that we can all hold in like creating that pathway for people. And sort of a unique journey that we've taken is that Building Up is now, to kind of save a long story, has essentially merged with Raising the Roof, and using Raising the Roof's Reside program, which is going across Canada, turning vacant properties into affordable housing. But we're actually now using that as a vehicle to help start social enterprises who can do the work on these vacant properties, and to give work to social enterprises that do exist to actually train and employ people to turn these homes into sort of temporary training centers as they're being turned into affordable housing, so that we're not only working on homelessness by creating more housing, but also preventing homelessness in the first place by creating pathways to really good jobs in construction through the renovations that are happening on these jobs. So through that process, Raising the Roof as a national homelessness organization has really kind of transformed our main objective and our main role within the homelessness space as kind of the title of this webinar, which is like using social enterprise to end and prevent homelessness. So we believe that, you know, work in the affordable housing space should be done by social enterprises. And it's sort of on all of us on this call and all other folks across Canada to kind of make sure that our enterprises are at a point where we can turn around to people running housing and say, hey, it's a good idea to hire us, you know, like you're not going to be throwing money down the drain. This is a way to spend money that you're spending anyway. It's not new money. This is money you're spending anyway to train and employ people, and we'll throw in a new house for free, sort of, right? Like that's kind of, rather than running a business, like rather than employing people to run a business, we're all running these businesses to train and employ people. And I think that's what social enterprises are all about.
Awesome.
I just add to one thing that, you know, might have been obvious to us in our discussions and stuff, but is important to share, is that there's, and Marc kind of touched on it, there's such a huge void in the market for people in the trades. And so really a big part of this solution was connecting vulnerable populations who are not attached to the labor market, training and preparing them to transition into careers in the trades. Because by doing so, when we look at the individual who needs support for housing, we're seeing that when we can transition them to successfully in the trades, with that training, they're able to start at a $22 to $24 wage, which enables them to have the opportunity for housing, right? So that's kind of the concept behind some of the enterprises, where it's not a social enterprise where participants will necessarily stay with the enterprise. As a linking enterprise, our hope is that we're able to train and then successfully transition them into long-term careers for housing stability.
Mm-hmm. And so maybe if we could stay on that theme, because that sort of segues into where you feel your organization fits within this prevention continuum. And so maybe if you could all speak to some of that and sort of where you feel the work fits within perhaps what we know of prevention, or how you've defined prevention within the spaces that you're working within. No order here, just whoever wants to go first.
I can go. I think for us, what we're really tackling is, well, I think both. We see that we're doing some prevention and we're also doing some solving in there. But what we're really working to do is take an individualized approach for each client. And we've recognized too, back to what I was saying before, that it really required kind of an innovative approach. And also not only that, we recognize too, this is not something we can solve on our own as an organization. This is really a cross-sector partnership that needs to take place here for this to be successful. We need to have for-profit on board to provide these very, more lucrative careers to our clients. We need to have nonprofit involved to provide the wraparound supports that are needed. And, some of the basic skill building and training that's required. So in the case of Construct, we have a strong partnership with the YMCA, as well as Leuna 506, which is union that provides apprenticeship and then transitions our clients into careers in the trades. The YMCA also supports us with some of the job development and career pieces. And in our team, we have social enterprise piece, obviously, where we're taking on jobs from the community and participants are able to join in with like hands-on training. And then there's also an in-class component. And one of the things that we recognized on the journey of planning is that many of the youth or individuals that are facing challenges to the labor market, it's not so effective to only have that in-class training. It needs to be kind of a hybrid model. And even more focus on the hands-on opportunities. So we try to keep that classroom part to a minimum, although we have been working to develop a portal, which hopefully can be shared around as well for trainees to get on and complete, some of the basic work, because it's actually interesting to see how in a lot of cases there hasn't been any type of guidance or intervention, or maybe a lack of parents or role models in life. We're really down to the very basics. And sometimes all it needs is that bit of support to like show them how to use measuring tape, to believe in themselves, that they can complete a task and set the expectations for what's required. So in terms of prevention, I would say that with our model of training and then transitioning them into careers and continuing to follow up with them, it does allow for people to get a wage where they're essentially able to afford housing. And because Blue Door's focus is already on housing, that's a big part of our program as well, where we're providing those case supports or wraparound supports to ensure that people are getting into a more stable housing situation, stable and safe. And then for people, you know, what's been heartwarming too is that people in our emergency housing programs have been able to join the program. And this has been a platform to help them transition into housing. And then our teams are able to work with them, like our housing retention team continues to connect them to community supports and all to keep the housing stable.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I think I'll jump in. You know, when I think about the customer or the client journey, when a young person crosses our threshold and says, you know, I'd like a job, I'd like some support in connecting with that job. And when you start kind of unpacking what has prevented a young person from being successful in their last job, or why perhaps they're seeking supports, and you start having those conversations, you recognize that, like, you know, being, particularly here in St. John's, being a young person 16 to 29 and having a lot of the experiences that they've had, particularly around the things that have prevented them. It's no secret that, like, these things are all connected. You know, intergenerational poverty, we have housing instability. You know, when you think about why does this young person, why weren't they successful in their last job at a retail store? Well, a lot of the times it comes down to things like housing instability, lack of transportation. There might have been challenges in, like, their mental health, their physical health, not being able to connect with a physician, you know, on a regular basis. And so, like, when you have these conversations, it's so humbling to say, of course you couldn't connect, the job didn't work for you. The first day you were late, the first day that, you know, you were fired. And that's not, when you think about it, and we have this bootstrapping culture, this idea that, like, pull up bootstraps, you know, you work hard, and that's incorrect. There is working hard and all those things, and it's part of self-determination and all those things. But at the end of the day, oftentimes the young person is coming across our thresholds and recognizing that they've been disadvantaged, and there's been so many barriers put in front of them that it would be impossible to connect and stay connected with the labor market under, you know, this bootstrapping idea that if you work hard enough and do enough, that all this should just naturally come. And we often see ourselves as a way, okay, well, let's unpack that a little bit. Let's understand what it is you're trying to handle. But then let's make a plan. Let's make a let's start supporting you to get to where you need to go. So I can remember a young person who worked with us who was late every day. She was showing up at, work started at 8:30. She was showing up at 9:30 every day. And we kept saying, what's going on? And finally, it was that the daycare didn't open until 8:30. And they had to take the bus. And so it's like, our role is certainly to, for a young person to come try on a job, get some experience, understand what it means to come to work, develop those skills, because that's not an inherent skill. We don't all know how to show up to work as hard as we can, leave, and then rinse and repeat. That's not, like, that's a very privileged point of view to some degree. And so when you're unpacking that, it's like, oh, it's not that perhaps not in a supportive employment environment, that young woman with a childcare issue would have actually been fired, and she probably wouldn't have had the agency or the voice to say, I have a childcare issue. And so when we look at the prevention lens, I do think social enterprise offers this really unique opportunity to create employment opportunities and use employment as a mechanism to unpack some of the tough stuff, support, and it's not dissimilar to housing, support in, like, what it means to, like, rally around some of those things, whether it's access it, like getting an alarm clock or riding the bus with somebody until they are able to ride the bus on their own. Sometimes it takes that like really individualized supports to actually unlock what's possible, because what's possible wasn't possible with those things in the way. And so if we're able to do those things, support young people in their way, and have, I think, unlock the value that a job can have, which is, by the way, value to the young person. Obviously, they get to take home a salary, a wage, they access supports and develop their skills. But then also it's the value you're able to unlock in your community. As Marc said, we're able to renovate affordable housing for other young people. Like, how incredible is that? I feel very lucky that that young people get to show up to work each day, on some of our job sites and say, I'm contributing to my friends who potentially live here. And there's something intangible about like purpose that really is a bit of the magic sauce when it comes to social enterprise, connecting with folks, and folks, I think, being able to get some of the tough stuff out of the way so they can actually see what is possible and what's on the horizon.
Awesome. Thanks, Chelsey. Marc?
Yeah, I think I would echo like a lot of what Chelsey and Emmy have said. Really, like, when I started building up, it was like, there's been like a real evolution of understanding what building up's role is. And I think we've slowly gone from a social enterprise that does workforce development to more of a workforce development agency that uses a social enterprise sort of as a tool because that's the one that makes the most sense. And I think like like some things that have shown me that that's what we've become is that like we have an in-house therapist that works with trainees that are having kind of mental health challenges. We're training people to get their driver's license. Where everyone has a caseworker that kind of supports them. We've actually just sort of changed our own sort of branding or whatever from, we're not a pre-apprenticeship program anymore. So that's sort of the traditional name of a program that would get people into an apprenticeship. Now we call ourselves a pre-journey person program, which is like the journey person is the end of the apprenticeship pathway. And it's like, once you finish the program, you're not done. Like, we're still here to support you. The first 4 months of our work with you is in a pre-apprenticeship capacity, but we'll be with you for 4 years through your apprenticeship pathway. And we're here to sort of like to really give someone that stability that will end this cycle of poverty or the risk of homelessness. It's not just about getting a job. It's about really like cementing yourself in an industry and having that really strong foundation. And we think like having been with people now, having been around long enough for people to complete the pathway, who graduate building up, we've really been able to see, okay, like people are going to end up coming back to us until that point when they get that designation. Mm-hmm. So we're really focused on building out like an alumni program now that really has not much to do with our social enterprise. The social enterprise is a really helpful tool because if we connect someone to a job and they end up going through something in life and need to come back to us or need more support, it's like, awesome, we can employ you now. 2 years into your apprenticeship, you can take on a supervisory role on some of our sites until you're kind of ready to get whatever's going on in your life away so that you can continue on that pathway. And another really cool thing that you would have never thought of when getting a social enterprise going is that, a traditional training program lasts for however long you have funding for, right? Okay, it's a 12-week program, 8-week program, 16-week program, whatever. But everyone who joins these programs is starting at a different point. Some people need less time, some people need a lot more time. So what the social enterprise allows you to do, say, okay, the 16-week program is complete, but there's still some transitioning to be done before someone might be ready to work full time with an external employer. So they just stick around on our sites, work with us, continue to have access to the caseworkers and all the training and all the support. And I've just found that like having the social enterprise tied into a workforce development program creates a ton of flexibility that makes the actual training better and allows you to pay people for their time in the program, which allows them to show up and take and like be in a position to prioritize it. So as far as like social enterprise's role in homelessness prevention, like I think that it can be a really full pathway that is very supportive into an industry. So if it's linked to an industry where there's a need for people, and if the social enterprise has enough work to be able to support people properly, like throughout their pathway, then there's like a ton of different ways that the social enterprise can be a part of homelessness prevention for an individual.
I think to add to that, Mark, I love what you said, because I think that the pathway is not linear at all. And so when you think about labor force, anybody on the call who's worked in labor market attachment or like youth employment supports, it's usually through like fairly like contained programs that are really specific with specific evaluation, and you hit the goal post, check, 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 and you're on into the world. And I think one of the things that we recognize and what social enterprise allows us to do is exactly what Mark just said, is that if in fact a young person is working, trains with us, works with us, exits, there's been many a time where a young person has come back to us. Things have fallen apart again, but with the social enterprise, it gives you some flexibility to say, you know what, cool, it didn't work that time, don't worry. We've got some employment here. You get on your feet. We'll work with a support worker. We'll get her next time. And for a lot, when you think about homelessness prevention, it's not, to be honest, it's not dissimilar that like sometimes housing falls apart. Like sometimes employment falls apart, and it falls apart for all kinds of reasons. We had a young person work with us for on and off. And when they left for about 9 years, and when they left finally and went on to employment, it was a real celebratory moment. And it was interesting because that young person had made multiple stops and starts, but operating as a business and as a program without judgment, and recognizing that these pathways are individual. Social enterprise and the job component of it allows us an opportunity to wrap supports around young people when they need it, and allow for the young person to kind of come in and out. Whereas traditional workforce development, you kind of do the program, get through the program, you're expected to move on. And when we think about a prevention lens, we need to be able to meet people where they are. And through a job is an interesting mechanism to do that.
This is amazing. So I have a script for those of you online. I have a script. I have a series of questions that I'm going to go through, but I'm already going off script because I have a question. And I'm picking up on a word that you've all used. You've all used the word stability a number of times. And so I'm very curious about how you then measure stability or measure resiliency in these individuals that you're working with. Speak to that.
I think in a situation where we're preparing people for employment and using employment as a vehicle to stability, I think it's a lot easier to measure someone's stability in that when you actually are their employer. So we can like determine that their hours are related to their pay. Like we know what we're paying them every 2 weeks. We know if they're showing up. We know when they're late. We're clocking their hours. And when they're not, we're the employer that has to be like, hey, we made a commitment to a customer that relied on you being here. You're not here. Now we're not able to satisfy what this customer needs. Now they're not giving us more work. And now we're not able to train the other 15 people in the program right now. So like you have a responsibility here to get, or what's going on? Like, how can we help? And I think when you're running a program, you can take someone's word for it. And they say, hey, I'm ready, I'm going to do it. When you're actually their employer, and you have that experience. And then you can go to that employer that you're trying to get to hire them afterwards and be like, hey, I was Buddy's employer for 6 months and he is now at a point where they're ready to show up every day. That's kind of you get a different perspective.
I think what's so interesting is that, like, even you can hear it right now, like each organization is kind of, there's no cookie cutter solution to this, and each organization's kind of taken this and morphed it for what works for their audience and what works in the context of their capabilities, right? So like, it's just intriguing to me to even be listening to all of us talk about this, because it adds, you know, different perspectives and views. So like, I think part of it too comes to where the organization's mission and vision lies, as well as the individualized care for each client. So like in our case, our ultimate, like our vision is for everyone to have a safe place to call home, and keep that home, because home is where you thrive, right? Home is where you can come home and feel safe. You can like take care of yourself. You can have an address to get your driver's license. You can have an address to get your health card. You can go to the doctor, you know, you can lay down for your vacation days, watch some TV if you need to, go for a hike, come back, shower. It brings housing is so much more than a house. It's a home. It's a state of being, right? And so that's where like we're trying to take people. So part of like for us, I think, and like Marc said, we're tackling all those things along the way. Okay, buddy, like, why were you late for work? Like, if you talk like that on site, this isn't going to go well. You know, those type of things. When you threaten to fight someone, you're gonna, you know, if we're not here, it's not going to go well for you, kind of thing. At the same time, we do want to keep that vision of getting them into home, and not just getting there, but actually staying there. And so that's where I feel like a lot of, like, we deal with those day-to-day challenges, but our intention is really to create that stability through housing, in answer to your question of how we gauge stability. So we do track all those outcomes along the way, but our intended impact is, like you said, resiliency, which I think if you're asking how do we gauge that, I think that that is also very much gauged by the client that's in the program and their feelings towards themselves, the increased confidence, the increased knowledge in how to deal with the challenge they might have been facing. Just the network itself is huge. Like, we're talking about people who might not have, you know, connections. Network is so much of life and employment, and, you know, even staying stable in the community, not understanding previous to this, you know, what happens if, you know, my landlord doesn't agree with me, or, you know, different things like that. So it's really, you know, how they say it takes a village to raise a child, involving the community and exposing them to the community that's there to support them. Like, what are the resources they need once they're in that state to keep getting that help? And so, yeah, we kind of have to like stay with them on that journey and check in on them and make sure that that support is ongoing.
And I think I'll just chime in there around the stability piece. I was, when you asked the question, David, it immediately was like, my head, I was like, show up for work. Because you need stability in order to show up for work. And so showing up for work, coming across that threshold takes certainly most, especially in the initial stages, a huge amount of courage. It is like, and one of my support workers who has done this work for a very long time, Corey, and he will always say that every young person who walks across the door is absolutely courageous because they've made the choice. And I think that the stability influences, like the stability that we can help provide, if the young person determines that they so want, then is certainly the supports and the mechanism, but also the regularity of the job. the regularity of the schedule. And, you know, there's great things about a job that provides stability. I think we all know what it's like, especially in pandemic times where our routine is disrupted and these things aren't predictable. Our pay isn't predictable. If those things happen to anybody here on this call, there's no ability to be stable. And so when we're able to kind of do that and measure stability, and when stability is there as much as certainly as we can, it's interesting because I think what we see as the most important outcome is actually increased confidence. That's the one we always pay attention to, because we often look at like, okay, well, what does confidence allow for you to do? It allows you to show up to work confidently. It allows you to assist your peers. It allows you to feel accomplished on the job. And so we're always paying real good attention to the measurement of increased confidence through some of our support through the case management. But one of the interesting things is we did a lot of, similar to what Marc had said, we did a lot of kind of soul searching. We always used to say our number one, our outcomes. What are our outcomes? Post-secondary and going to post-secondary or competitive employment. And that totally, I often call them in our world, there are capital O outcomes. But what is required to achieve those outcomes is actually what we got to pay attention to, because those things will probably happen anyway. So once we start, if we do the right kind of career development, we do the right holistic supports, there's stability within the job itself, and their skills are developing, their confidence is increasing, then you get the opportunity for a young person to self-actualize. And for us, if you think through the whole Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it's not dissimilar. So by the time you get to that ability to conceptually to vision what was possible, what's required all along the way is how you can kind of shape your program, your interventions. But that's where you're building resiliency through that. That stability is that bottom rung. And as we build towards that self-actualization, which is choice for that young person to decide what they plan on doing, hopefully you've met a lot of those basic needs along the way while developing the person and assisting them to develop the tools that they need to get there.
Brilliant. So it's funny that I'm going to use a reference of trades in my next question, because I think it's important for me to get at the sort of the mechanical components of your programs and how they then intersect with either your organization or the broader system that we're working within. And so maybe if you could all speak to that, maybe how does it, if you're attached to an organization, because again, Marc's work is a bit different. If you're attached to an organization, how does a young person or an individual access that program within that space? Or then how would others outside of your organization access the opportunity that exists within your social enterprise? If that makes sense. So who are your people? Maybe is better.
I can go.
Yeah.
So there's been about 1,000 applicants on average a year to the Building Up program over the past few years. And we're taking on about 120. So the demand for these positions is super high. And I think it's because a huge part of it, I think, is the fact that it's paid training. Because a lot of the reasons that people are in positions in the first place was maybe that there was a financial pressure that took them away from being able to pursue education. And then to be able to be paid to be in math class or be paid to learn and then get into a career is a very unique opportunity. And, you know, this really debunks like this idea that people who are unemployed don't want work. Like people do want to work, they just need the opportunity. And I think social enterprise is a unique place to offer that opportunity because you can give paid training, especially when the social enterprise is intending to get people out of that program into the sector. As far as like who the people are, a lot of people with criminal records, a lot of people from low income neighborhoods, a lot of people who are refugees to Canada, a lot of people that didn't finish high school, 90% racialized people has been kind of the makeup of the program. And as far as like what are the components of the program, got some really good advice early on to go to the industry that you're trying to get jobs for and say, hey, you have these job vacancies, what would make someone a great candidate for them? And using that as the sort of curriculum design, like let's build to that. And that's where we've realized things like getting someone a driver's license is really important, because like 95% of job postings in the trades require like access to a vehicle and a license, which is like not necessarily the essential skills that you would train in a traditional training program. And that helps identify what are the important health and safety certifications to get, because there's no actual like pre-apprenticeship designation. It's not a thing. But if you go to an employer and you already have all of your tickets, which is like your certificates of working at heights and WMIS and whatever, then they're like, oh, this is going to be easy for me. I don't have to do any of this training. They can just be ready to roll. But ultimately, what they have all told us over and over again is what they most need is like, we don't care about the hard skills. We care about coachability, punctuality, dependability. And therefore that has kind of been like all these employers, not all of them, most of them are related to the unions, where they have these incredible training facilities where they could teach you how to build a bridge. Like that's irrelevant. It's more about like, do you have the base like ability to read a measuring tape and add and subtract fractions? So like that's a big part of it. But also like, can you understand the culture of the industry and kind of be ready for it and show up and work hard? So that is like one thing that having the social enterprise really lets us teach, because like, and this is a real push-pull of running the social enterprise, is like, do we want to take the stance that it's like, let's operate like a traditional is, that's what people are going to get when they leave building up, and they better be ready for it. But like, or do we want to be more sort of soft? But then are we then just like creating an atmosphere where people get away with stuff, but then they're going to go to an employer and then the whole thing falls apart because they weren't ready for it? So like towing that line is the hardest part. Like the hardest part is, you know, building up has brought in a bunch of softies. Like that's just who has wanted to work at building up. But we're preparing people for the exact opposite. So it's like, what is our role in that? And how do we like make the social enterprise a transition where people are going to get a taste of that, but still the comfort and the ability to fail and whatever. So that sort of balance is like kind of the goal, and you're always kind of overcorrecting one way or the other, it feels like.
Chelsey, Emmy?
Yeah, totally. I couldn't agree more with Marc. That becomes a really big challenge when I often say, like, you know, just because the construction industry can be challenging, but we can also be better. One of the things that we've done around that is trying to tie agency with that and youth voice, and really focus in on things like workplace respect and those kind of things, that if in fact there is a situation where something not right is happening, that a young person does feel comfortable regardless of their position to say, like, that's not right because of X, Y, and Z. And so it's this interesting thing, because it can be a really challenging industry to work in, particularly you know, especially at an entry level position. So we try to best ensure that young people know that they have a voice at work as well when they move on. But it's that push and pull, that balance between support and accountability can sometimes be a bit of a challenging thing. I think one of the pieces that I wanted to hit on just around young people and the young people that we work with is that sometimes the systems that we have to support young people are not necessarily set up for transitional employment, and they can sometimes get in the way. So for us in our world, what we found was that a lot of young people would come to us who were actually on income support. So income support here in Newfoundland, welfare, I don't particularly like that term, however, depending on where you are, is what it's referred to. But income support being that these young people have, the necessary financial supports to be able to survive. And so when a young person comes in and does decide, hey, I'd like to come to work, how income support is impacted and changes the basic needs, stability, and safety. And during that transition is such an important piece that we have to pay attention to. So for example, if a young person comes to us, they're on income support. Income support is assisting with paying their rent. They're assisting with paying with their access to their drug card. Child care becomes a component of this. And then all of a sudden they start working. And then there's a clawback, I guess, on the income that goes towards their housing or what have you. And then all of a sudden, you've destabilized a young person's life while they're actively trying to change it. And it's the system that exists in order to keep people safe and housed and secure. But unfortunately, that transition becomes really challenging. So one of the things we've been working super closely with the provincial government here in Newfoundland and Labrador about, let's figure out what these transitions should look like so they're not peaks and valleys. So you can do good, you can try and do good and do harm. That's the whole concept here, is that okay, well, how can we soften that transition from what it means to be stable and supported to wanting to go to work? Oftentimes, as Marc said earlier, I think, and Emmy, it's not that people don't want to go to work. It's that it's really, really hard to go to work, especially if it's going to work requires change that destabilizes a person or limits their access to necessary supports that they require. And we've been doing a lot of work with the province now to figure out, what does that actually look like? What are the actual problems? And let's evaluate where are the issues? Because, when you think about a young person who comes into impact construction, they go from potentially on income support to full-time employment. So they're completely off that system, now employed. And so what does that mean? We need to really understand, how is their rent impacted, their drug card, their child care, all of those pieces. And from there we can work. But not all young people are ready for full-time employment, which is why we have a portfolio, why we run a clothing store, why we run a manufacturing shop, is because we know that especially there's not a lot of young people, and we do have to apply a gender lens. We found that we weren't having a lot of young women or female identifying women really connecting in with impact construction. And so our manufacturing facility, though, we have, and it's a really creative area, there's an incredible amount of young people wanting to kind of work in that space. And our clothing store, surprisingly, is often mostly young men want to work in our clothing store. Yeah. And so it's a fascinating thing. And so having that choice is a really important component to being able to do this work, to meet young people where they are, but they also need to be able to choose which one they go into. But at the same time, that choice can't be in exchange for basic needs. So with those part-time opportunities, which are at the store and the shop, that has worked really, really well for a lot of young people who are maybe experiencing more barriers, or perhaps it just works for them better. Their income support then becomes a real, you need a degree in math to figure out what the impact actually is going to be with the hours worked. And so if we think about these systems, they all kind of do have to work harmoniously, or we are not actually going to be able to get where we want to get to. And there's a lot of really exciting work to do in the policy space to really encourage really building bridges between the peaks and valleys around basic needs and self-actualization.
Yeah, I think to build on what Chelsey said, because I was going to comment on for us, like one of the places that we started in inviting partners to send participants into the program was with OW as well. We learned there very quickly that, you know, when they're invited to our training and employment, they'll lose that support. And like Chelsey was saying, that becomes de-incentivizing if you're going to lose the little tiny bit, which is not nearly enough for anything, of security that you have, right? So we're having those conversations too. But what it meant for us was to really look at our program model and to make sure we keep inserting, like, and there's so many new situations you come across that you wouldn't have calculated for in the beginning because of each person having their own story and their own life. So like in some of our first grants, we baked in like transport and food and, you know, obviously wraparound supports. But over time, we've added in, you know, psychotherapy. Now we also we're applying for other grants to support, you know, women or parents trying to enter our program who are obstructed by not being able to have care for their kids. I think one thing too is, and you know, many of us who have sat at these tables or conferences about nonprofit or social enterprise, we kind of get into that challenge sometimes where nonprofits are kind of required to fit into a funder's model or their description of what the program should look like. And it was interesting because even after we did our planning for Construct, as we were applying to receive support at different levels, we were finding ourselves like bending over backwards and like morphing to try to fit these funding models. It's required us to become even more innovative because like a certain funding stream might allow for you to provide a living allowance to participants, whereas another one will come down very hard on how that's not okay. And you know, you can only have these supports if they're only willing to pay for staff. So we've had to think creatively about how we can support all the individuals, even in different funding streams, to have all that they need for success. And it's you know, like between the team, obviously, it's pretty cool to, you know, piece all the puzzle pieces together and to provide. We really do want to provide when they come into the program an allowance that, you know, covers their food, their transport. You know, we have trucks as well that can help facilitate transport. We've tried to really think, like Chelsey and Marc have been saying, what are all the opportunities we can give for the best chance of success? But those are some of the pieces, like Chelsey mentioned, the systems gap almost, where it's almost like you get penalized for trying to do something productive or break that cycle. And like what we see through research is that social enterprise as a solution, both parallel and linking, but like the linking enterprise does really help with that labor market reattachment and breaking a cycle from dependence on welfare or the system. And so we really have to be there while all those pieces aren't adjusted yet to provide that support, so that they don't have to, participants don't feel like, okay, we just have to stay where we are to have that security of, you know, that small amount or whatever it is. And then I think too, what you said about who's in the program, everyone Marc said, And as well, we've found that we've opened it up to the service providers in York. And we have just gotten a ton of interest. So there's already, like I was checking in with our team a few weeks back, we've had intakes from like over 10 organizations. And there is, like Marc said, there's a huge demand because essentially it is an opportunity and a platform for not just for youth, but for anyone in a vulnerable situation to receive that kind of training and network and support to get on with, you know, a possibility of a career.
Awesome. We have a number of questions from the audience, but I've got a couple more questions. Again, these nuts and bolts things that I'm very curious about. So where would people start if they're thinking about moving into this space? So maybe some advice from each of you about where they would start. Marc, you offered up a really important one. If you're looking to get into this space and you're looking to do a social enterprise around construction, go speak to construction. But what else? What are these other pieces that people should be conscious of?
I would suggest making sure your organization's ready for it. And that sounds like super obvious, but what I mean when I say that is it's going to require a bit of hybrid thinking. And so if you're thinking around with an entrepreneurial mindset and folks are willing to dig into what an entrepreneurial mindset or an innovative mindset looks like, and thinking folks from all levels of your organization, whether that's your senior leadership, executive director, CEO, but most importantly, your board of directors, if that's your situation. It is recognizing like what's that gonna take, and you know, if any folks on the call have started businesses, you know, it takes, you know, it takes a strategic risk mindset. It takes willingness to build something, fail, learn, pivot, change, grow, get smaller. It requires, it's not the same stability as a program. So if you think about a program model, you do your theory of change, you do your logic model, bam, you got a program, evaluation structure, Bob's your uncle. With the business, there's a lot more going on that you really do have to pay attention to. And it's the new, and what makes social enterprise so special is that it's so complex. You've got your beneficiaries, you have your customers, you've got your stakeholders, you've got your funders, you've got your board of directors, you've got your colleagues, you've got the rest of the agency you have to think about. And so like from my world, you know, I think about our employment team, and we just are like the renegades sometimes of choices for youth. It just always seems that we're making something new or doing something crazy. But it's been fascinating. And the one piece of advice I can say is that, you know, these kinds of approaches are really how we're actually gonna change the world. It is really about testing solutions, really digging into what the problems are, and that type of thinking is essential to create a social enterprise, but it's also culturally really relevant right now within all of our spaces. You know, we know that tackling these complex, wicked problems are gonna take thinking through things in a different way, in a divergent way, and being willing to take risks and be willing to try new things. And so, you know, if you are thinking through this, ask yourself if your organization A is ready, B, ask if your board of directors is ready, and really kind of start bringing and fusing those cultural components so that when you start, that you've got the foundational stuff, and perhaps that push and pull or that fear, you're operating from an abundance mindset to start with, and that's the foundations for success and making a social enterprise happen.
Great advice. Emmy, Marc?
I was just going to add, I think a good way to look at it, to build on what Chelsey said, is that there's kind of, when you're starting a social enterprise, think about the business and the social piece. It doesn't really matter whether you're a charity or a nonprofit or a for-profit. You will have to think about kind of both those pillars in tandem. And that can be a huge challenge. I remember my first conversation with Marc, and he was telling me about there's no greater nightmare for a business than kind of how we have to run it. With what would look good for our social enterprise model is that we have a continuous turnover of people in the enterprise, right? Because essentially you're wanting those participants not to stay with us, but to go on and do something bigger and better with their own lives. So from a business model, that is incredibly challenging. And when you're doing construction jobs, for example, you know, the demand can really flux too. And so you don't want to create more instability by like reeling more people in and letting them off. And, you know, you really have to plan carefully, both for the business aspect and the social. And I think charities, in a way, if you're thinking to launch it, you kind of have the advantage already in the social piece where you can, you know, apply for funding and kind of create a program model. And we found, you know, because of our internal capabilities, that's been a real strength. And we've had to think about, as you're hiring, you really have to think about who are people that think completely differently, you know, better in the interview. I hardly understand a word they're saying about like construction management and all of that, although it is so important that everybody on the team has a heart for this work, because I think what can be very challenging is, you know, you could get the most exacting person to run your business and burn out and be super frustrated by the fact that they're supporting vulnerable populations who you need to just have a huge heart and patience for at the end of the day. And so, and I'll steal the words from these smart people, because like I have to give Marc, Chelsey, and others credit for, you know, where we started in our social enterprise, because they had already gone on before. But really what you're ending up looking for to start is like a unicorn type of person who has business acumen, who's great at construction, but then has a heart for the social piece and will be like, you know, lead the team to mentor and all those important pieces. So I think to build on what Chelsey said, that's one thing I would say, really think about those two arms and make sure that you're kind of ready to manage both, because there can also be a lot of tension between that, because you can't only think of social, because if you're taking on jobs and you've promised to deliver, you kind of only get one shot at your reputation as a business as well. If you start screwing that up in the community, it's not long before people want to choose another contractor that can deliver on time and with good results, right? So you really need to be sure that you're ready for that. And so like in our case too, we haven't built all our internal capabilities, but that's where like we've talked with Marc too at building up, and they've been like a really great partner, so that when we know something's out of our scope, we're like, hey, Marc, can you work with us on this? Can building up take this on? Because like there's so many years ahead of us, right? And I think it's important for everyone listening to know that there's really shouldn't be competition in social enterprise or in our social sector, because we're all working hard actually to solve a social problem. Like nobody is benefiting, nobody's making profit. What we're trying to do is build a better life for future generations. And so I think that you'll find, if you're listening to this and you're wanting to do something, and you've kind of heard what we said, reach out. We're all happy to, you know, facilitate or connect you with someone on our teams that can provide you information that you need. It's important, obviously, to start building a plan as well, but sometimes it's helpful just to have the exposure and the conversations that can help to guide that planning. So, you know, of course, we're welcome to do that as well. And we're not the only ones. There's so many great, you know, individuals and organizations that have started enterprises similar to this, or in different fields too, as Chelsey mentioned.
Marc, anything to add?
Yeah, I think I agree with everything that everybody said, totally. And I would just, maybe one more thing would be that if you are thinking about this, like, oh, does this fit in my organization? I would say, great, go for it. Everything Chelsey said is true. Like, make sure that you know you're ready for it. And also, like, don't look at it as a way to make money to run other programs. Like, social enterprise is not a money-making scheme. I mean, the word social enterprise can be used really broadly. What we're talking about is a workforce development program that uses a social enterprise as like the tool to do that. This isn't going to be a way to fund other programs or fund overhead of your organization. All of our programs have funding. They're not entirely, I'm not sure about everyone. I can say for building up, we've always been about 70% covered by sales and about 30% grants, and that's sort of been the case as we've grown. It's tend to be like what the split has been for us. And there is no intention of ever being fully funded through sales. Like, that's not the goal. I think it can be misleading to think that sales are inherently more sustainable than grants. Well, not if your grants are like diversified and are tied to good relationships where they're sustainable, the same way that, you know, a COVID pandemic can come and make it illegal for you to do your work as a business, and you're going to need those grants to stay alive. For example, may or may not be a thing that happens, but also it's like, if all of your work is with one customer, that's not necessarily more sustainable than having 3 different funders that are supporting your program. Like, it's about sustainability, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it all needs to be through sales. And I think that if you're trying to run all of the wraparound supports entirely funded through sales, you're going to be charging prices for your work that no one's going to pay for, because it's too expensive to pay someone to try to take a driving lesson or to have a training center or to have a therapist. Like, construction is a really tough industry to manage projects well and be competitive. There's a lot of like small contractors running around quoting super low. And so I'm saying social enterprise makes a lot of sense because I think it's really the best tool for workforce development, especially within the trades industry sector, not because it's a moneymaker.
Right.
Yeah. So
Great advice. As much as I want to ask my own questions, this isn't about me. So there's a series of questions from our audience group, and one of them being specific to, and Chelsey, you touched on it with the diversity of the social enterprise opportunities with choices. But given construction or the trades is typically a male-oriented field, how have you all managed sort of the interest from females, young or old, having interest in working in these spaces?
We have, like in our case, we serve families as part of our emergency housing. So we do already have a focus with, you know, not just youth, but to broader audience. So we have had some interest from females, but what we've tried to do also is actively promote that on our social media and in our messaging. And one thing that we're working towards, I might have touched on it before too, is the potential to promote like women-specific cohorts where we are able to provide tailored support for childcare or for other, you know, things that might prevent them from joining. But I think the first piece is really that education and acceptance to, like Chelsey said, build that confidence that there is an opportunity there, because like you said, typically it is very male dominated. But if we're able to support them into that, there can definitely be a success rate, and that's something that we're trying to promote. And I know Marc has had experience in that as well, so I'm going to let him go.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting because we would put out these, you know, like just recruitment in general. Like, we would go out and speak to groups and people would ask us questions, and then we would find that the info session people would turn up and there'd be like 100 people there and like 5 women. And it was like, oh, like either people are not, like the social workers that are referring people are making, like doing some sort of screening in their head accidentally, or people just aren't interested. And we just kind of dove into it and made a point of it. And now it's about 1/3 of the people that are going through the program are women. And a big part of the program is like exposing, like the in-class stuff we do is like exposing people to the construction industry. And like a lot of people come in saying, oh, I want to be an electrician, I want to be a plumber, I want to be a carpenter, but there's like 50 trades.
Right.
And really showing people, oh, like there are all these different pathways in this, some more physical than others. And there's definitely a place for women in the construction industry. And like we've seen that our employers, I mean, there have definitely been employers that have been like, said things that were like, well, okay. And you've got to kind of work through that. But then there's definitely a lot where it's not a thing, and they're taking people that are qualified for the role. So the biggest barrier for us to have more women in the program has actually been like who's putting their name forward, and we've really tried to recruit directly with like women-led programs, and that seems to have evened it more closely.
Yeah.
I think, having a diverse portfolio of social enterprises really kind of allow for just a young person to choose. And so the chips fall where they may. And it's so interesting that we actually, I think we are about 20% typically women involved with impact construction specifically. And as I said, our neighborhood clothing store, it is most often mostly males, which is certainly not necessarily what we expected, but at the same time, like also just really happy about it. And the shop is typically is more chosen by females or female identifying. And it's fascinating just to see, because I think it's more about the work. Like the shop really allows for some creativity, some hands-on work, requires, a bit more working together on the multiple parts to create a thing. Whereas neighborhood is very much talking to folks and talking to customers, and then impact is very much the construction. So it's building. One of the things we found that was a gap, and we haven't really sorted it out yet. I think if you want to have more female participants, you need to have females in mentoring roles, and
Right.
you need to have female staff so that there's a level of comfort, I think, or at least a barrier reduction for women to participate. I think I would say, we haven't totally gotten that, because as Emmy said, you're looking for this when you're trying to recruit for carpenters, or in our case, asbestos specialists, or anybody working in the construction space, it's certainly dominated by men. But moreover, you're really looking for the best candidate who has that social component to their work. So, I think we've really recognized that that's a piece that is an opportunity to show women what's possible, and highlighting, certainly women's success and ensuring there's representation within all of our promotional material in our open houses. I think we do open houses similar to Marc, that they're interacting with a variety, a diversity of the staff and folks, just to ensure that there's a level of comfort there, or connection or role modeling.
Amazing. 2 things. We needed 2 hours. Second thing being, there's a question about specifically around the racialized community, and not only the representation in the homeless population, but also interest levels and in the work that you're doing. So how do you ensure, so this is gonna have to be rapid fire because we have 4 minutes. How do you ensure that those from the BIPOC community feel comfortable in these spaces and are welcomed into these spaces?
I can go. I think do our best to have a diverse staff and case managers with lived experience, or facilitators with lived experience. Doing our best to do that, and just creating a really open, warm environment as much as possible, where people feel comfortable sharing what they're going through, and kind of just being an open, equitable place to work. I mean, I think there's been all sorts of things that you don't realize that could be done better, and it's kind of been a learning process to try to figure out what those are. But just to try to be intentional and try to be as caring as possible.
I think for us, it means working with partners in the community. And so, you know, when we look at other community partners like the Association of New Canadians here in St. John's, we do a lot of work with First Light, which is our Native Friendship Center here in the city, and recognizing, you know, certainly as an agency, as Marc said, operating, you know, ensuring all of our practices reflect being an open and equitable employer, but then also leaning on folks within the community to just, you know, work together to ensure you're supporting racialized or Indigenous folks who are in your community well, and what that takes. So I think as folks creating this employment, it's, you know, certainly listening, and also supporting one another within the community to ensure you're doing things in the most equitable way.
Emmy.
Oh, I was going to say, if you wanted to get in another question, you could, because I think Marc and Chelsey covered it.
We got 2 minutes, so I'm just plunking in here into the chat. So we have a series of questions. We have 2 minutes left, so we won't get to all of them, but we have a commitment that we'll pool our thinking, or not our thinking, their thinking, their minds. We'll mine their minds for the answers to your questions, and we'll get back to each of you. I'm sorry, again, we could have done this for 2 hours. And so I want to take this opportunity to thank our panelists, Marc, Chelsey, Emmy. This was exactly what we needed. It was the structure that worked for the conversation. Thank you for your openness and the richness of this dialogue and going back and forth on this. There's more to be done here, and there's more to learn here, but I think we're all better off because of the time that you spent with us today. And so I'll maybe turn it back over to Lindsay if you have any more housekeeping items before we wrap up formally.
Hi, no, David, you covered it. So we will make sure that we mine all the questions that were in the chat box, and we will try our best to get through all of them and send you, everyone here today, those responses along with the recording of this webinar so that you can share it throughout your network. So thank you so much, David, for your great moderation as well.
Yeah, that was fun. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Take care.